All right. So good evening, everyone. I want to thank you for being with us this evening. My name is Peter Coyle, and I'm the director of the Sacramento Public Library. This program is being recorded. Tonight's program is Let's Talk About Banned Books, and this is part of our Let's Talk About series. And so we're glad to have you join us. It's our first one in a long time, post-pandemic, or maybe still in the pandemic, but we're grateful that we're getting back to some sense of normalcy. So thank you all for joining with us. Before we begin tonight, I want to acknowledge the unfortunate and tragic violence and deaths that have occurred across our country in the last few weeks in everyday places, grocery stores, places of worship, and schools. These truly have been tragedies, and we express our heartfelt sympathies to all those who've been affected by these horrible, horrible violence. Our Let's Talk About series provides the community with a safe and respectful environment where participants may tackle subject matter that is often relegated to anonymous social posts and private conversations with friends. Past discussions have focused on topics such as racism and immigration. The library exists to provide access to information, including the insight we can gain from each other through civil discourse. So our purpose tonight of this panel is to have a conversation about book banning. And we have a panel who discuss what it's like to have your book banned or challenged, what intellectual freedom means, and how attempts to ban books impact your right to access materials. We felt this was a timely program to have because of recent increase across the country of efforts by groups to restrict and remove library materials, books from not only school and public libraries, but most recently, even bookstores. This program comes at a time when we are truly trying to understand what it is that public libraries do, and that is to provide information and access to everyone across all areas of the community. Our purpose of libraries is to provide access to information without judgment and to be fair and impartial in how we do that. This program really is important to all of us because the free access of information is really what is part of what makes America, America. And challenges to that effort and that ability of people to find information can have a chilling effect on our government and our society as a whole. The Sacramento Public Library is committed to meeting the needs of the community where they are. We're undergoing election season here in Sacramento, and you can find ballot drop boxes for the state primary elections at public libraries and in-person voting center at select locations. We're also hosting outdoor programming for young children and their families, including story time and play-based learning activities. We've also started our summer reading program for the year, and you can find information about all of these programs and more, and all of the things that Sacramento Public Library offers you at our website at saclibrary.org. Now, to start our program off this evening, I'd like to introduce our moderator. Mr. Bill Slayton is a senior consultant with Leading Resources and specializes in board governance. For 16 years, he served as an elected board member of the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, which provides electric services to 1.5 million Northern California customers. He served 3 terms as president of the board. Bill also served for 7 years as a gubernatorial appointee to the governing board of the California Public Employee Retirement System. It's the largest non-federal public pension fund in America. Prior to his leadership roles on these boards, he served on 2 publicly traded commercial bank boards, as well as on various nonprofit boards, including the Sacramento Public Television Board. He's a graduate of the University of Texas. He's married and has 2 children, and he and his wife reside in Northern California. And before I hand it off to Bill, I just want to express our thanks to the library for this panel and Bill for taking the time out of their evenings during the week to take part in this panel. We really appreciate everyone's participation and that we have such a great crowd that has come to hear this panel of experts, and we are really looking forward to the conversation. So Bill, I'll let you take it away with this distinguished group, and I'm looking forward to hearing this fantastic conversation.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. And thanks to the Sacramento Public Library for creating the Let's Talk About It series. This is really an important series. So just before we get started, a few housekeeping items. If you wish to post a question, please post it in the Q&A portion, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And keep in mind that if you put comments in the chat, they will be public. We'll reserve some time at the end of the program. We'll run till about 7 o'clock, and then we'll move to questions from the audience to address your questions. The chat will be monitored throughout the program, so feel free to put the Q&A question in, and then we'll get to it a little later in the evening. Captioning is available, which is also listed at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you be respectful in the chat series. Anyone who violates the code of conduct will be blocked. Lastly, a recording will be made available on the website saclibrary.org later this week. So now we'll move on to the program. I have just a couple of introductory remarks before we meet the panel. The idea of banning books conjures images of piles of hardcovers in the street going up in flames. But over the past few years in the United States, book banning has taken on a different character. It's taken place in public school board meetings and in after-school discussions between librarians and concerned parents, and more recently in legislative bodies. The American Library Association recorded 729 challenges to library, school, and university materials in 2021 that targeted more than 1,500 different book titles. That's a record for attempted book bans since the ALA started tracking them in 2000. A similar analysis by PEN America, pen.org, from July through March found 1,586 instances of books being banned. Now, attempts to censor and ban books are not a new phenomenon. In 1650, Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony tried to get what they thought were blasphemous books removed from their community. And consider how the Confederacy banned books such as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin for portraying slavery in a negative way. Or in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was an outcry that the Harry Potter books were dangerous for children. And by the way, the series went on to sell 500 million books worldwide and inspired a love of reading among many young people. But what sets this latest wave of book banning apart is how much of it's being driven by politicians. PEN America found that more than 40% of the bans were tied to directives from state officials or elected lawmakers to investigate or remove books in schools. The Washington Post's Annie Gowan chronicled how a Texas county judge personally walked into a local library and took books off the shelves, ignoring the library's procedures in which a person is supposed to fill out a challenge form to be reviewed by librarians. The United States was founded on a principle of freedom of expression. We might not always like what our neighbors and fellow citizens have to say, but watching the severe restrictions of news and information flow in Russia is the latest reminder of how quickly censorship can turn into something truly sinister. Librarian and editor Mary Jo Godwin once said that a truly great library contains something to offend everyone. But the reverse is also true. Great libraries have materials on their shelves or in their e-circulation platforms to support everyone trying to educate themselves, from homeschooling Christians to LGBTQ youths. That's why it's so important that we talk about it. And that's why we're here this evening. So let's meet our panel. Justin Azevedo. Justin, hi.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming this evening.
Justin has worked for Sacramento Public Library since 2007. He's been a marketing assistant, a librarian focused on programs and services for teens, and a manager for 2 Sacramento Public Library branches. He's currently the youth materials selector for the library, where he reviews, selects, and purchases physical and digital library materials for age 0 to 18. He's previously served as co-chair of the Association for Library Services to Children's Intellectual Freedom Committee and has been on revision work groups for multiple interpretations of the ALA Library Bill of Rights. He's a father of 2, and he plays a lot of video games. Welcome, Justin. Dr. Gail Pittman. Gail, are you there?
I am. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all.
Great. By day, Dr. Pittman works at Sacramento City College as a planning and research administrator. By night, she writes children's books and engages in other forms of subversive creativity. Those are her words, by the way. Her debut picture book, This Day in June, won the 2015 ALA Stonewall Award, and it has been on ALA's top 10 banned books book list several times since its publication in 2014. She has since written 7 additional books for children and teens, including The Stonewall Riots Coming Out in the Streets, My Maddie, and The Fairy Project biography of Evelyn Hooker. She lives with her family on a small hobby farm in Northern California. Donnie Surla. Donnie, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Great. So Ms. Surla has 20 years of experience as an educator. She's taught every level of high school English, including English language learners to advanced placement literature. She served on curriculum committees, school city councils, and accreditation panels. She was chosen by the Mondavi Center to study Shakespeare at London's Globe Theatre in 2009 and was selected as a semifinalist for a Fulbright Award for Educators in 2021. She's currently the longest tenured teacher at Rio Vista High School and serves as the Gay Straight Alliance advisor. And now I want to welcome Seema Thapa. Seema, welcome. Oh, you have to unmute. She will. Well, you good. So you can, hopefully you can see her on the screen. Seema is a high school student at Natomas Charter School and also is at the Performing and Fine Arts Academy. She is considering being a writer. She is invested in the integrity of literature throughout America, and this topic to her is a clear violation of it. She is doing her research and trying to get a broader perspective of the history of book banning and the way it is manifested in our current political climate. So Seema, this is part of your contribution as well as education tonight to be with us. So thank you very much for taking the time to be here. So let's get started. And I want to start, well, let's see, let's start with just some comments. So Justin, welcome.
Yes. Hi. I just wanted to say that as kind of evidence in my bio, this topic has also meant a lot to me throughout all of my roles in the library. It's actually what got me into libraries in the first place. And it's been the common thread to all the work I've done in libraries. I remain angry and concerned. So I'll try to be calm tonight about some of the stuff we're talking about. But I'm heartened by the fact that so many of you are here to talk about it with us. I think that says a lot of positive things about where we're all going.
Great, great. Well, thank you, Justin, for being here. We look forward to your comments. Gail, welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'll just say that my interest in this topic is very personal. And I would say that my involvement in the freedom to read movement is, it was sort of accidental. It was one Twitter message from someone I had never met before who lived in a small town in Texas who said, sent me a message on Twitter and said, hey, did you know that people are trying to ban your book? And that started it all. And I'll share much more as we go on about that incident as well as others that have happened since then.
Great. Thank you very much, Gail. Donnie Surla, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be able to take part tonight. For me, banned books and the issue of banning books goes to the heart of anytime we restrict knowledge and information and ideas, we run into dangerous and harmful territory, especially when it concerns children. So yeah, I think that's all I need to say about that.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll be talking more. You'll be talking more in a while. So Seema, welcome. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. First, I just wanted to say that I'm really excited and honored to be on a panel with so many amazing and dedicated people. And I'm really excited to get into this discussion about such an important topic.
Great, great. So that's our panel. So let's get started. And I've got a question for Justin, and kind of to frame things here for everyone. It's important for all of us to understand the curating process that libraries use. So how does that work? How does a book get accepted or rejected by librarians?
So for the Sacramento Public Library, we have a collection development policy. which outlines a lot of the work we do there. And it has a lot of bullet points or a lot of reasons why any particular book might be selected for the collection. But the short of it is that us being a large system, we have the ability to get as much as we can in that serves our community. So what that means to me practically is I want to make sure that if there's an audience of one for a particular book or piece of information in the Sacramento area, in the area we serve, that we are allowing free and equitable access to it. And that's a broad answer, but it's a broad question. In terms of something that might not be selected, might be rejected, there's also a number of reasons for that, but really what they boil down to, well, first of all, largely it would be because we don't have all the money and all the space in the world, so we don't have the budget or the shelves to have everything. So if we don't have something, that usually boils down to, do I have something already that serves the purpose well of what this is trying to do? So that could be anything from, this particular book doesn't have great reviews and I have something like it on the shelf that does, and it's very popular. That may be a deciding factor. Or it may be this book has outdated or incorrect information in it, and I have a whole section of books from authoritative sources that have better information in. That might go into it too. And I will just end by saying, even with that being said, if I make that decision and then I see that there's a need for it in the community, people are asking me for it anyway, they want access to it anyway, for whatever reason, because I don't act in local parentis, so I don't assume why someone might want to have a particular book and make a judgment based off that assumption, then I will change my thought. I'll think again about whether something is accepted or rejected.
Okay, interesting. So, Gail, how is book? You mentioned this before when you made your introductory remarks, but how has book banning affected you personally and professionally? Talk a little more about that.
Sure thing. So several of my books have been challenged in a variety of different ways, but the one that's gotten the most notoriety for being challenged is my first picture book titled This Day in June, which really is a simple rhyming book about an LGBTQ plus pride celebration. And there have been, like I said, challenges throughout the country focused on this particular book. And the first time, the first challenge, when I heard about the first attempt at banning this book, there was a lot of news coverage, a lot of press, sales spiked for a period of time. And so of course that was like a temporary, I guess you could say, benefit in a weird way. But I would say that the harm and the stress, both personally and professionally, has far outweighed any type of financial benefit. Not only have my books been, potentially, challenged and in some cases outright banned. A few years ago, a pastor in Iowa recorded a Facebook Live video, 30-minute video, where he, spouted off all kinds of fire and brimstone about how, damaging these books were to young children, and then proceeded to burn a series of books, including mine, in a trash can live on Facebook. And so when you see something like that, it's like they're, coming after your child, right? Like it hit me personally in a way that's just hard to describe. And I think it's important to note that this isn't, just about banning books based on ideas. The book bans, at least with respect to my books, are, the thing that's being challenged is our very community, our identities. And that to me feels very sinister and dangerous. And the fact that there's a whole political, feels like machine kind of behind that, has a really strong impact on me, both personally and professionally. So I'll leave it at that for now, but that's, kind of the briefer version.
Okay. Gee, I'm not a writer, so I can't feel that personal reflection. I can't remember who it is. I just saw that today. Somebody was reported in the paper that one of who's the author of Handmaid's Tale?
Margaret Atwood.
Margaret Atwood. And they're auctioning off a fireproof copy of The Handmaid's Tale. And they ran a little YouTube video of her with some kind of a fire thing showing that it's fireproof. So sometimes people use irony to, address or give a feedback on that. So Donnie, you mentioned before we went on the session that you've had conversations with parents regarding books. So how do you keep that emotional level at a reasonable level when you're having these discussions with parents who hold very strong views about what their children should be exposed to?
Well, for me, one thing that I like to keep in mind is what's the end result here? What is it that mom and dad are after? What is it that I need from their student, or what I want for their student, and what does the student want? And keeping those goals in mind helps sometimes to tamp down the emotional response. And as I was speaking before, most of the time when you're dealing with individuals, you can come up with a working solution that works for me as a party and the student and parent as a party. It's when one parent decides that none of my 380 students at my school should be reading one particular thing, that it becomes a much more difficult answer or solution.
Wow. Okay. So Seema, you expressed before in the earlier conversation your interest in this particular issue. What do you think would be impacts on if there's a generation of students who are not exposed to some books and have an incomplete understanding of history or race? What do you think the implication of that is?
Well, I would say that I think any form of limiting books or education in any capacity, it definitely feels like a step backwards, and especially regarding topics like racial identity or sexual identity, putting limitations on that, especially for younger children, I think would be very dangerous, because if they're not getting a comprehensive understanding of these different identities and the deep history that goes into them, and histories of oppression and the institutional problems, as younger kids, they feel less inclined to grow up and make changes. And that would just, I think, be very negative for everyone. So limiting the kinds of identities that are available and accessible to all, I think is just very dangerous, especially for younger children who are definitely the majority of the target for book banning and censorship.
Well spoken. So go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, like, I love that she said all of that. I am, the father of 2 young children who, like me, are part of a, fairly privileged intersection of identities. And I talk with them a lot about how when this subject comes up, because it does, for my 11-year-old son, it comes up. And I tell him that, people, are concerned about you feeling bad, about you feeling like, learning some of this stuff. And because of who you are, they're very concerned that might make you feel bad. But don't we want to feel bad and angry enough to change it? And he's like, yeah, that's, if I didn't know, I have to be mad about it, and I have to be sad about it if I want to change it. And that's exactly right.
So Justin, to follow up on that, Um, should parents should have the right to decide what books their children have access to. So how do you reconcile that with a library that's full of lots of books that some parents may go, well, I don't want my child to have access to that. How do you deal with that?
So I have a yes and a yes but answer to that question, and it does kind of, I saw it may come up there. Someone asked a question that kind of touches on this on the Q&A too. I mentioned that I don't act in loco parentis when I was talking earlier, and I realize that's jargony, so I want to explain what that means. It means that as a librarian, I don't stand in the place of a parent or caregiver. I don't get in between the way you want to raise your child, because I certainly wouldn't like it if you got in the way that I wanted to raise my child, right? So as a librarian, everything I do needs to be within that framework of like, I don't want to get in the way and parent for you. The corollary of that is that I don't want to get in the way of another parent based off of what maybe work for you or work for me. I have to extend that right to everybody. So part of defending parental rights, that's exactly why we do it the way we do it, is so that at no point am I becoming obligated to become in between a caregiver and their child, right? That's the yes and answer, because I'm a parent. I get it. I have rights as a parent, and I want to protect mine just as I want to protect yours. The yes but answer to this question is that children have rights too. And unlike parental rights, which are going to be different, every parent I ask is going to have a different definition of what parental rights means. Children's rights are enshrined in the Constitution. The First Amendment right to freedom of expression, the 14th Amendment right to privacy, those do not come with a minimum age. And as a public servant, a steward of public funds, I'm obligated to protect their rights just like everybody else's. And I realize that as a parent, again, I get it. I got 2 small children. I realize that very quickly becomes a sort of academic discussion in the face of common sense, right? But the way that I try to approach this with other parents is, unfortunately, a lot of kids don't live in a safe and loving house like mine or like yours. And I need to protect them too. Some of the stuff that we have the privilege to pick and choose in terms of information could be life or death for these kids. And because they have those constitutional rights, I have to protect them as well. So that's why things can seem like, well, why would you let this information be available to, well, it doesn't have to be to your child, because I'm not telling you, you have to give that to your child, but I need to make it available for someone who might need it. Now, I've been talking too long. All of that hinges on the idea that concern is being brought in good faith, which frankly is not the case a lot of the time right now. So these definitions, rather than thinking of them as a way to convince or comfort someone who's not looking to be comforted in the first place, it's more about thinking about why this is important and affirming why we do these things. We don't make these choices just to do them, just because I want to throw books at your kids. There's very important reasons why I might do something that looks like it stands in the way of your parental rights, when the absolute opposite is true.
Well, thank you. Thank you. By the way, somebody watching did point out that I misquoted the book. It's Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. So just interest of clarity. Yes, go ahead, Donnie.
Yeah, Justin was making excellent points, and I wanted to underscore an aspect that he brought up, which is banning books is an issue that is really exacerbated by social class and by affluence and by socioeconomic situations, because a book will never really be banned for a kid who has access to Amazon. If you can order a book from Amazon and they're all out there, then you are always going to have access to that information. However, if your main access to information and materials and literature is your classroom library, or that once a month that your teacher takes you to the county library or your school library, then in essence, what's being done when we're banning books is we're keeping them out of the hands of marginalized, poor children and children in poverty. So oftentimes I think we know this, but maybe it's not brought out into the forefront that banning books is a type of class warfare, in my opinion.
Well, that raises an interesting point. And Justin, I just want to come back to you for a moment, because when I was preparing for this, I came across a term I was not aware of before called equitable access, which is a principle of libraries. And if you could just make a quick comment about what equitable access means, because I think it goes to Donnie's point.
Well, I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that libraries are neutral spaces. That is something that comes up every now and again. And the problem with you framing equitable access that way is that it assumes a vacuum, and it assumes that everybody is coming, they're starting from the same place with the same end result. And that's not true. It's just simply not, as Donnie was just saying, my kids can get something on Amazon, but a lot of kids, that's not even within the realm of possibility. So what equitable access is, the short definition is making sure that everybody, regardless of background, of means, of wherever they're coming from, wherever they're starting from, has the same access to information as someone that we serve, as anybody else. And so that means reckoning with, again, different economic backgrounds, different access to technology, cultural barriers, systemic institutional inequities that affect some people more than they affect others. All of that plays into how easy it is for you to access a piece of information, whether that is a picture book for a young child or an academic research, a piece of academic research, versus how I would do it. So equitable access, intellectual, another way of saying intellectual freedom, quite frankly, is engaging each time someone comes into a library, engaging with what those barriers are, in order to make sure that they have the same access to the information and the services we provide, than someone that has more access, more money, more, less barriers to overcome. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, very much so, very much so. So Gail, I want to come back in history because of your experience. I assume, did you grow up in a family of readers? I assume maybe you did. And did anyone, to your knowledge, censor what you could read? And did you even know that you were being censored or restricted? What's your experience?
Yeah, I did grow up in a family of readers, actually my first, and I was a voracious reader when I was a kid. My very first job was in my local public library. So it was like literally for me being like a kid in a candy shop. And I'm a Generation X kid. And so for those folks that are familiar with that term, it's a generation of kids that I think were, pretty feral. We're the latchkey kids, the kids sort of left to our own devices. So I had no restrictions whatsoever. I was reading all kinds of stuff, ranging from, Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, to Stephen King and V.C. Andrews, right? I would say a relatively young age. There's reasons why folks in my generation are terrified of clowns and sewers. For those of you that have read It by Stephen King. And I in many ways appreciate the fact that I had such open access, but I also, and I kind of want to underscore what others have said, I think there's a difference between having open access versus having some guidance and having some, someone who can help, not censor. I think it's a difference. There's a nuance there, there's a difference in meaning. But to have, someone who can help curate some potential, books that I might be interested in. I wasn't, for example, reading books by or about people of color for the most part. And, granted, that may have partly been a generational thing, but there were books that were out there that I think would have been really good for me to read at that time. I was just left to my own devices. And so, there's pros and cons to that. And I think that it's, again, it can intersect with the discussion on banning and censorship, but I also think that there's room for recognizing the freedom to read and having access to different types of materials while also having someone to help guide you and, point you in the direction of, opening up opportunities or opening up, possibilities. I was also a kid that was raised middle class. And even though we didn't have Amazon back in the day, anything I wanted to read, I could read. Access, for the most part, was not an issue for me, but it very much was, if my circumstances had been different, then I think that what was available in my public library would have looked very different, or in my school or anywhere else.
Yeah. So Seema, as a student, where do you seek help or guidance or curating, to use maybe a more technical term, but where do you go for advice on what you want to read and what would be great for you to read? Where does that happen for you?
Well, I also am a really big reader. So a lot of the books I kind of discover on social media is a big one, what I see people talking about and the kind of discussions they're having. And if I think it's of interest, I'll try to look into it, as well as my school's library is a really good resource for me as well. We have really amazing librarians that really care about recommending good books that will teach us a lot. I remember my librarian recommended Slaughterhouse-Five, and I really liked that book and it stuck with me. My history teacher is a good one too, because he's really interested in diversity and inclusion for all. So he gives me some interesting recommendations as well. And yeah.
Oh, that's great. So
Can I add something to what Seema just said? Because it made me think about, and relating it back to the previous question that you'd asked. One thing I wasn't reading when I was younger was about anything depicting LGBTQ plus people. And as someone who's LGBTQ plus identified, that would have been a game changer. It just would have. And again, it was a generational thing. The availability of books, depicting that community in a positive way were limited. But had that representation been made available to me, or if folks had pointed me in the direction, there were some books at the time that I think really I could have benefited from. I think to see myself reflected in that way would have made a world of difference for me personally. And so, again, it's a different kind of slant on the access issue. Again, I said a moment ago, anything I wanted to read, I could, certainly I could get, but I also have to know that it's even there in the first place. And, there were plenty of books that I didn't even know were there in the first place.
Yeah, that I want to tack on to just to kind of get in the weeds a little bit about when we talk about a book that's appropriate, right? Like trying to determine what is appropriate for a certain age or what content is objectionable. The words obscene and pornography are getting thrown around a lot these days when talking about these kind of books. And I think it's important to affirm that someone's existence, the existence of a person, that's not obscenity. That's not pornography. Those words have legal definitions, and saying that does not make it true, and it is not actionable in terms of policy. And a lot of times when we get into these discussions about whether a book is appropriate for a certain audience, even a very young audience, the existence of a person should never enter into that discussion the way it does now. And the other thing I want to go over, to tack on to what Seema was saying as well, I think we need to give our young readers more credit. I see a lot, including today, I see a lot of talking over them in terms of us deciding what is actually appropriate or harmful for an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 14-year-old. And kids know more than we sometimes think they do. And I think listening to them on this more than we are right now would serve us well.
Very good. Well said. So Donnie, let me come back to you. Should some books be optional versus required reading in school? How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, our current guidelines for what's required, and I, of course, there are more nuanced questions like required by who? Required by my school district, required by the state of California, required by the federal government. Our Common Core standards say that really only mention in my guidelines, there's, I believe, only 2 authors that are mentioned. One is William Shakespeare, and the other is, oh man, I F for me, because I cannot remember the other writer. If anyone knows who that is, Justin, I'm looking at you. No, nothing. All right. Oh, Dickens. If there's I'm happier including authors and including writers, and doing as much as I can not to restrict, because as we restrict, the marketplace of ideas is narrowed down so much. And the conversation that was just happening about representation, it matters. It's so important for our marginalized populations, for our queer kids, for our people of color. But it's also important for our affluent Caucasian students as well to read about neurodivergent people, to read about people from other countries and from other cultures and from other walks of life than their own. It's extremely important. When we say representation matters, it's not just for the minority population that we're representing. It's so that those other populations can see these others in a different and more tolerant light. So I have actually very little put onto my plate that my students have to read. And so I don't have a whole lot of experience with, oh, this kid is going to be forced to read The Great Gatsby. Maybe because of the small and personable nature of my school district, we're able to work out those individual little problems a lot easier, I think, when one parent has a problem with a teacher's curriculum. But I hope I answered that sufficiently.
I think you did. So Justin, do libraries remove access to books
Every day.
And so what drives those decisions?
So that's for those who aren't familiar with the term weeding. That's what that means. Part of a maintained collection, a living, breathing, and useful library collection involves weeding it, which means removing books to make room for newer and better ones. As I said before, the way that a collection remains relevant is to make sure there's room for the newest and best stuff, and also that the stuff that stands the test of time has the there's proper access to that as well. We remove books because of condition. They're loved and worn and gross and stained and stinky, and we need a new one or not. Also, if it's brand new, if it's 4 years old and it's circulated one time and it looks brand new, I could probably find something better, because clearly my community doesn't need that book. we remove books because they get superseded, because they're obsolete. You know, a biography of somebody that has since passed away that doesn't mention that somewhat salient fact. Books about Pluto as a planet, can't find those anymore. We also remove books if, you know, contrary to what many might think, if a book gets challenged, there is a chance that we would restrict or remove that book, because we take all of those seriously. We have to, as part of protecting people's rights. I can't make an assumption whether a challenge to a book is in good faith or bad faith. I need to approach it always like it's in good faith as part of protecting people's rights. And we have in the past taken a book and someone, you know, thought it was, you know, inappropriate for a particular audience or something, and we've reviewed it and thought, in my tenure in this position, and thought, you know what, I think you're right. I think this is better placed in a different section than it is now. And then we did it. I catch a lot of those before anyone notices them. They come in and they get on the shelf, and I get my hands on it and look at it and go, whoops, nope, I think this goes somewhere else. I better do that. And so we'll do that as well. So yeah, it's not a situation where we just keep everything on the shelf and make everybody mad and we don't throw out books. We get rid of books every single day. And if we do it wrong, if we're not careful about it, we leave them in a dumpster outside, we'll end up on the news. That has happened lots as well, because people do not like it when they feel like their library is throwing out books, even though it's something we do a lot.
Uh-huh. So tell me more about restriction. How do you restrict?
So I can only speak to this coming from a public library standpoint. It's important. I don't know that we've really hit yet that there's a difference between public libraries and school libraries, because the former does not act in loco parentis and the latter to some extent does. So some of these conversations look differently in schools and school libraries versus public libraries. But restriction means exactly what it said. I mean, we get cute with words like censorship and banning and book burning, but really the whole thing we're talking about is restriction. I'm restricting access to a book, whether that means I'm taking it out of the library completely so that nobody can get to it, or if a book meant for children by both the publisher, by professional reviewers, by the author and creator, a book meant for children, someone decides, nope, it's not for children after all. I'm going to make it harder for children, the intended audience, to get to it. It's got to be in the adult section behind a desk, you know, under lock and key. That's also restriction. I want to again reiterate that, like, all restrict, you know, that doesn't mean, you know, we never restrict anything. We restrict stuff all the time. But it's a matter of being intentional, and it's a matter about doing it not because content is objectionable. That's always part of a conversation when we talk about where a book should go, who the intended audience is, both from the creator side and from a library or school side. We're always thinking about, like, who is this for, right? That's why we would purchase it and spend money on it in the first place. That's why we put it on the shelf. Who is it for? But I kind of lost my train of thought there. Objectionable content by itself does not make that decision. That can be part of the conversation. But because I or you or someone over here may find that objectionable or not right for their family, their audience, what their idea of what the audience is, that by itself is not enough. There needs to be another reason for restricting it.
So let me move from that. Thank you, Justin. Let me move from that to in the school environment. So Gail, how do teachers provide guidance to students on what to read? How do you make that kind of a decision, and how do you influence children?
I think there's probably a multi-layered answer to that. And some of it depends on the school that they're in, the guidance that the school district provides, you know, what state you're in, you know, like your, whatever your geographical environment might be. So there could be all kinds of factors influencing what teachers are recommending or not recommending. And I think it's fair to say, and Donnie, you probably can speak to this also, that while challenges certainly happen at the public library level, at least in my limited experience with my own books, they happen very, very frequently in school environments. because parents are the ones that are, making those challenges, that they don't want their kids reading a book in a particular class, or they don't want a book in their library, or in, circulation, or whatever the issue may be. So I think there's a number of different factors. Teachers, they rely on the guidance that they get from the feds, from the state curriculum guidelines, local curriculum guidelines. That many teachers I know rely on recommended reading lists from the American Library Association and local library organizations, school library organizations, and so forth. There are political organizations that put together recommended reading lists. And again, depending on the context of the school environment, that certainly could come into play as well. So kind of a complex answer all over the place. I'm not a school librarian, and I'm not a teacher, at least not in the K-12 system. And so I don't have, firsthand experience, at least from that lens. But look, when I look at the challenges that some of my books have undergone, of course, many of them have been in public library systems, but especially of late, there have been quite a few within school library contexts.
So Seema, as a student, I want to know your opinion. Do you ever think it would be appropriate to restrict access to a book? What do you think about that?
I really don't think that it would be a benefit to anyone to restrict any kinds of books. I think Justin was talking about this earlier, about how they keep all kinds of books in the libraries, even if they may seem outdated, but they wouldn't want to get rid of it altogether. And I think that's a really good way of going about it. And I think certain books, even if they are outdated, I don't think they should be highlighted or celebrated as much. An example I can kind of think of is at the elementary school near me, they've stopped doing like Dr. Seuss week or Dr. Seuss nights, just because of the things that have been increasingly come to light about some of his beliefs that he's held and things he's said. So I don't think that they should be put under a spotlight like that, but I don't think that they should be removed completely. And the solution should lie more in instead adding more books written by people of color or people of diverse backgrounds, and trying to create more robust teaching and library systems that really push those books forward, and helping to teach these books sensitively and thoughtfully to students and young people.
Great. So Donnie, you just heard what Seema said in terms of her opinion about this. How does that strike you? What do you think about it?
There we go. Yeah, I agree with Seema, especially when it comes to some books you've got to restrict access on. I mean, you don't want kids reading Mein Kampf and stuff like that. And I think that's a really dangerous idea to say, if we don't agree or like the message coming out, that we have to eliminate it. And certainly, I mean, that's a really extreme example. But I teach of Mice and Men in my 10th grade English class, and John Steinbeck uses a very particular racial slur in that book. And we have a discussion in my class about why I continue to teach this book and why it still has value, even with those slurs in there. And then we also read authors that are people of color, as Seema was talking about. We bring in both contemporaries of Steinbeck, Black authors from his time period, as well as contemporary writers and pieces of literature from now that reflect on both that time period and what Steinbeck was doing there. So yeah, I think it's more about being inclusive and shining the spotlight in the right places, but not eliminating access to that content entirely.
Well, then that raises a question I have for you, Gail, given what Donnie was just talking about. You've been involved in the Freedom to Read movement, and I'd like you to comment some about that and what your experience has been. Because everybody, you know, we're in California here, and other states are not necessarily treating it the same way.
Well, and I would even push back a little bit on that and say that some of the challenges that my books have undergone have been in California.
Really?
And so California is not immune. I mean, we have, there's a different political climate in much of California, although California is certainly not a monolithic state by any stretch of the imagination. One of the challenges to one of my books happened in Oakland, California. So, you know, that just to provide a bit of a counterpoint. So,
yeah, I was thinking more of state, you know, there in other state actions in other states at the state level is different than California, but you're right, at the local level, it's community by community. So
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, I mean, again, there have been challenges that have happened all over the place, in public libraries, school libraries, etc. The very first one, I think, offers a really, I don't know, a powerful cautionary tale, I think. That was the challenge that Peter Coyle, the Sacramento Library Director, has some awareness, you know, was involved in that, not on the, you know, the challenging side, but on the defending side. And that's what really got me involved in the Freedom to Read movement, was just, you know, as an author of a book that happened to be challenged. And in this particular situation, the person that raised the challenge was the mother of a young girl. And the story is that this book was, you know, on a shelf, and the child plucked it off and opened up to a particular page and said, "Mommy, why are those two men kissing?" or something like that. And then, of course, the story goes from there. Mom picks up the book and is horrified, and then goes ahead and files a challenge. That's the story that went out there. The reality is that the woman that issued the challenge was the wife of a local politician, and was connected to a very conservative political group that at the time had strong ties to the Tea Party, that has now morphed into something different, but, you know, still very right-wing, very evangelical, very conservative, and very anti-LGBTQ plus. And it was really through that experience that I started to better understand the whole political machine under many of these book banning situations. That, you know, in some cases it really is just a parent that, you know, is acting in good faith. In many other situations, it is this whole engineered thing. And that's what happened in Granbury, Texas. And to cut to the chase, that particular book ban didn't survive, but I think that the folks that engineered that challenge achieved their goal, because what ultimately happened was that the folks that were more politically conservative basically took over the library board, you know, so the next time there were elections, boom, they just saturated the library board. And now, you know, here we are 2022, several years later, the woman who had initiated that challenge in the first place currently sits on that library board, and now I believe is running for a seat in her state legislature. So there are political reasons why folks are doing this, and it's not surprising to me that we're seeing more book challenges of the, in my opinion, scorched earth variety. It's not just like one book here or one book there, but it's like a whole list of 750 books happening all over the place. It's not a surprise to me that this is happening, A, when the Supreme Court has started to lean more conservative, and B, when we're in midterm election season. So again, to put some context around some of this, that there's certainly individual and personal efforts, but there are also very highly engineered efforts. So that's a long drawn out anecdote, but let's just say that becoming involved in this whole thing has certainly widened my awareness and, given me much more understanding of the forces in play.
Yeah, a lot of it is an end run. A lot of it is, we're spending a lot of time today talking about our methodologies as, librarians, teachers, educators, our methodologies, the reasons for the way we do the things we do, the policies in place, the rules that we play by, and which often don't allow for someone to come in and say, I don't like that this book has queer kids in it, get it off the shelf. And since the rules don't allow it, and multiple angles that trying that hasn't worked, let's just get on the governing board that makes those rules and tear them up. Let's do it that way instead. That's what we're seeing now. And it's frightening. It's not just as a librarian, as a person who does this work. It's frightening. As a parent, I'm frightened for my kids at what we're seeing these days.
Do any of you have, and maybe this, Donnie, I know you have a very small school district, so it probably may not apply to your particular school district, but we're also, I think, seeing this same thing occur, manifestation on school board elections. And it would seem to me, and Donnie, maybe you've got a comment about this, for a school board to get involved in the decision of the books that should be in the school library seems to me to be outside their typical purview of a school board. But do you see that happening or hear about that happening as well? Not just community libraries.
Oh, for sure. Our school board is instrumental in approving curriculum, and that goes from our district accepted approved novels that we can choose from when going to teach, to the textbooks that we have in our classroom. It's very much set up that way. And I mean, we have, like I was telling you, we haven't had a lot of pushback district-wide. More so, we would have an individual parents coming in and saying, I don't think that this is appropriate. But usually in my experience, it's for their own student, which is a very different conversation. And the solutions that we can come up with are very different. It's very rare that a parent comes up to us and says, here's this thing that you're reading or this information you're going over, and not only do I not want my student to have access to it, I don't think anyone's student should have access to it. That is a very different thing. And then if that's true, they are immediately directed towards a school board meeting, and they have to take it up with our school board. So yeah, that's definitely something that now, whether or not they're out of their range of expertise there, I mean, sometimes, kind of, but it's certainly the job they ran for. That's certainly something that, approving the curriculum is definitely what they do. So
let me thank you, Debbie. Here's a question, and maybe excuse me, Donnie. Maybe you can answer this, or maybe Gail can. So we're now into some questions from the audience that have been submitted. So This one is a question about the guidelines and who develops them. Is there a panel of child development specialists, for instance, for when children should learn about sex in reference to what is being proposed in schools for children under the age of 8? So would either of you like to comment about that? Okay.
I can say that at least in California, that curriculum, at least in the public school system, it's largely state regulated. So I couldn't speak specifically as to whether or not, on a state level. I mean, I would believe that there are child development experts coming in to understand how to talk about sex in a age appropriate way. But it's, again, when you're looking at the California public school system, we're looking at state regulated curriculum. And then obviously local school districts can, implement depending on how school boards, how they see fit. I think it's also important to distinguish between, again, I think there's a, kind of a difference of nuance here. That, on the one hand, there's the question about how to talk about these things in age appropriate ways that are developmentally appropriate. And then there's the issue of, not talking about it all, right? Like there's, like sort of there's the positing it as either or versus, seeing the gradations of developmental appropriateness. And I say that given that there are some states that have, well, prior to now, there were states that had these so-called don't say gay laws on the books already. And now we have a couple of states that are attempting that. And the rationale is that, there's certain topics that are not developmentally appropriate for kids below a certain age. And the issue that I personally take with that legislation is that it's framing it as an either or rather than from a developmentally appropriate type of conversation. Kids learn about sex from day one, whether it's just understanding, learning about their bodies and how their bodies function, all the way up to, how people have sex, contraception, sexually transmitted diseases, pleasure, so there's a real range of topics within that. And unfortunately, I think it's a real disservice if it's framed as an either or.
Mm-hmm.
And that sometimes happens.
Good point. So Justin, I'd like you to see if you could address this issue. Can you speak to extreme laws like the one suggested in Idaho's state legislature to potentially arrest libraries? I think they're talking about librarians who provide objectionable books to children.
Yeah, that's been in the works for a while now. Those laws are created by a specific lobbying and legislation group. They're copied and pasted and passed around state legislatures. And only in the past year or two, because of the political climate, they're starting to take it up. I was going to say, just for what we've been talking about right now, from a public library perspective, what you'll hear a lot from us is, I am not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer. I not only am I not willing, but I am in some cases legally forbidden from giving you medical advice or giving you legal advice. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm only here to facilitate access. I can get you medical information, I can get you legal information, but I cannot advise you on either, if that makes sense. And the thing about these laws, again, they use words like obscenity, pornography. Those have legal definitions. They have very specific prescribed legal definitions. And standing in front of me and telling me, well, I think this is pornography, that doesn't mean anything to me. That's not, you can think that. I may agree with you, actually, depending on what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But in terms of restricting access to a book, or in terms of arresting me for an anti-obscenity law, that goes beyond opinion. There's legal definitions to that term, right? Same with when we talk about, like, well, what about a book on sexuality, contraception, procreation for younger children? Who decides what's appropriate, what's not? Again, like, I'm not a doctor. I couldn't actually tell you that. What I can say is, you would not want me saying, no, you don't get access to this book because I believe it's not appropriate for you if it's about any other subject. So I can't do it with this one as well. It sounds like I'm being flip here, but I'm really not. I'm breaking it down into the most simple terms that I, sitting in my professional chair, can break it down. Now, as a parent, as a guy sitting here with opinions, I could answer that question a lot differently, because I definitely have opinions about what I think is appropriate or not for a child, what representation should and shouldn't be on a book on my shelf behind me. But that's not your library there. That's not what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about the public library that you come into. So my opinions have less weight, other than guiding me professionally, than the things we've been talking about today. If a book is determined by its creator, by its publisher, by the people who catalog it, by state, regulatory boards, and by legal, like state and federal law to be appropriate, then I'm not going to gainsay that, because I can't, right?
So this is a question from a viewer, and this is available for any of you to answer. How do we deal with books that might promote racial stereotypes or encourage hate or misinformation? What do we do about that? Gail, you got a thought on that?
I think it really depends. I think context is everything. Justin, you had mentioned a moment ago that, the library has, when the library is weeding, right? Like figuring out which books to keep and which ones to potentially get rid of. Some of it has to do with circulation. Some of it has to do with whether or not there's a better option that has more accurate information. There seems to be kind of at least two schools of thought. One is that, there's value in retaining materials that, contain racial stereotypes, but otherwise have some type of value, because that can be a springboard for conversation, education, understanding, and so forth. And so, you would want to contextualize it within, that discussion, right? So there's that school of thought. And then there's the other school of thought that, for people of color, for people who are, members of historically marginalized groups who might be misrepresented in these books and materials, that reading those slurs, reading about those stereotypes, seeing those stereotypes can be very, very damaging, very, kind of reignite historical and personal trauma. And so I don't have a clean answer for that. I hear the two schools of thought. I can't say that I personally land cleanly in one versus the other. I think it really depends on the book and the issue and the other value that might be associated with that book or material. I also just want to be clear and say that even though I am speaking as someone from an historically marginalized group, the LGBT community, I'm also white. And so, it's hard for me to, to think about whether to put myself in the shoes of someone who's been historically marginalized in a different way. And especially if those are the only materials that are available. If there's not other types of representation to counter those stereotypes, it again just reinforces and reignites trauma.
Good point.
Can I
Sure.
talk about this a little bit?
Sure.
So harkening back to the first question for me, which was how do you select, how do you decide what goes on a library shelf? Like, this is of paramount importance, especially now. Especially books for young children and for teens. I'm very concerned with how people are represented, whether it's authentic, whether it's coming from an authentic place, whether it's done without stereotype. I want to add as much to the collection as I can to have those options available, to have that be seen. And part of it is to balance some of the stuff that does not do that well. And the Dr. Seuss, Seema brought up Dr. Seuss. That's a perfect example. Some of you might remember, I think it was last year, when a couple of Dr. Seuss books went out of print. They decided that Dr. Seuss the institute, the state decided to take about 6 titles out of print, partly because they had some stereotypical art illustrations in them. And that's normal. Books go out of print all the time. But it hit the news and everybody had a lot to say about it. And that changed everything. For like, if a book goes out of print, goes out of print, I can't get more, that's fine. Suddenly everybody wants these books, right? Because they're in the news. And not only does everybody want these books, but a lot of people are now very concerned that I'm going to take them off the shelf. I'm going to burn the books. Librarians are going to burn the books. They're getting rid of Dr. Seuss. They think Dr. Seuss is offensive now. Because people were stealing them and selling them on eBay for, hundreds of dollars and whatever. And so the question came to me a lot. So what are you doing about those? And my answer was, well, what do you mean? They're on the library shelf. They're all checked out right now. I mean, you could place a hold. I'm not going to get rid of them. Why? There's no reason to get rid of them. I just can't get more. That's what out of print means. And that's the thing, is like when it gets on the news, when everybody's talking about it, now the conversation changes because now it has artifactual value. It may be actually harmful, a book, because of these things, but when it becomes part of the cultural conversation, suddenly I have an obligation that I didn't have before, because people may want to read it for a reason other than, again, I can't assume they're just going to find it on the shelf and be inadvertently harmed by it. Those Dr. Seuss books, what I noticed, the ebooks, we had ebooks of about 2 or 3 of them. Holds for those went through the roof too. You can't steal those. You can't protect them from book burners. You can't sell them on eBay. The holds went up on those because it was in the news and everybody wanted to read it for themselves. And that's exactly what my job is, regardless of what my opinion is upon it. So yeah, it sucks that I have some harmful books on the shelf, but it's like Dr. Pippin said, it's not an easy answer.
Yeah, well, it's not. I have a new appreciation for the job actually that all of you have in trying to educate and inform. Boy, it's interesting. So I want to move to, there are private groups that are addressing this particular issue in a restrictive way. So maybe some of you have some thoughts on what are effective ways. This is a question from the audience. Effective ways to proactively prevent private groups like No Left Turn in Education, Moms for Liberty, Parents Defending Education from getting a foothold in my community school, my library, or my bookstore. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Show support for your teachers and your libraries and your schools and your school boards before the fight starts. Don't wait for the fight to start to show your support for what they're doing.
Good point. Gail?
I would agree with what Justin just said. I would also say that for writers or aspiring writers, and Seema, I'm looking at you, write what you want to write. Write from your heart, write from, write what you are motivated and propelled to write. And, just writing is an expression of who you are. And it's it can be a very personal thing. I mean, it's, there's reasons why people write books and then they, or they write stories and then they're afraid for other people to read them because it really is sort of a window into your soul. And I would say that writing is an act of courage, and that words have power, and that you have, I look forward to reading your writing at some point, and I'm sure you will become published one of these days if you're not already. And, people want to ban or censor because of the power that words have and the power that books have and the way that they have meaning and change people's lives. And I always want to remember that.
Good point. So here's another question from the audience. And this kind of feeds us in the same topic we've been talking about. Having just been through a book ban fight in Spanish Fort, Alabama, I'd love to hear you all speak to the importance of the local fight. Even my father, who agreed with me, felt it was a hopeless cause to fight to keep an LGBTQ themed children's book on the shelves, Mr. Watson's Chickens, with our library board, which is the city council. We ended up winning and we were shocked, but I have to believe we can't give up the local fight and feel defeated. Comments from anyone? Well,
I
Done.
could just reiterate the very brief story that I communicated with you before we went forward publicly. In my classroom library, I have information and literature. I have a LGBTQ plus section, and it by no means is a required reading, but it's there for those students that want it, the students who are seeking that out. And it's a resource in my classroom. There was a parent who also worked for the school district, who as a custodian, who saw this material in my classroom library and was very, very upset, and complained to my principal and to our superintendent that I should not be indoctrinating children with this information. It turned out fine. It turned out great. I did not remove that literature or any of those resources, and that student was not forced to read any of that information or use any of those resources. But had I backed down, or had I immediately removed those things out of sight, my classroom would have become a less equitable place. And I wasn't willing to go there. So is it worth it? Yeah, it's definitely worth it. And are you going to lose sometimes? Yeah, you're going to lose sometimes, but I think we all have a commitment to stand up for equity of thought and equity of access to representation, and to feeling like you're part of a community. And I won't back down on that for my kids. So they all deserve to feel that way.
Good. Thank you. By the way, there's a comment in the Q&A. Did I hear correctly? 40% of all book bans and challenges in 2021 were presented by lawmakers and politicians. And that was when I did the opening remark. That information came from PEN America, which is pen.org. And they say the freedom to write is their tagline. And it said that 40% of the bans were tied to directives from state officials or elected lawmakers to investigate or remove books in schools. And I think that's a more recent phenomenon. I think historically you would have seen less of that, but you seem to see more of it now. And I see the shaking of heads.
There's a lot of patterns like that are, I mean, we you know, again, we're kind of assuming this framework of like, well, this is just about good faith concerns, right? And about, you know, like just respecting each other's views. Last year, ALA's top 10 challenge books, 8 to 10 of them were challenged because they had queer characters in them. 8 of 10. This year, I think it was similar, might even be 9. There's what is being said about why challenges are being brought and why, you know, we need to think harder about, you know, these policies and what librarians and teachers do. And then there's what's actually being done. And they don't, I would say, germane to the question about the local fight and getting involved and being concerned about what's going on in libraries and schools, don't pay attention to what is being said. Pay attention to what is being done. And that includes about you personally. I've been called all kinds of things. I've been called far left and far right in the same week. It's immaterial. What is being done, not what is being said.
Good point.
That's important.
Good point. Well, Justin, there's another question for you that came from the audience. Does the public library have formal or informal interaction with homeschoolers?
Yeah. I mean, I may not be the best person to talk about this because I haven't been on the front lines in a while. I am now very much back of house. But we work with homeschoolers in the library branches all the time. And from a selection standpoint, I do a lot of selection of books specifically for homeschoolers. That's made difficult sometimes by how available a book that's popular among certain homeschool curriculums might be. Sometimes they're not available in a way that I can make them available in a cost-effective way in our libraries. But for example, we have book request forms for, patrons of the library can request that we look for a particular book and purchase it for the library collection. And a lot of those come from people who are running homeschool programs in their homes and would like access to books that we don't currently have. And if I can provide that access, either through adding something to our collection or through a program we have like Zip Books, where you can get it from Amazon, so that you at least have access to it, even if it's not in our collection. I do that because, again, that is a need in our community and it's incumbent upon me to meet that need. And I know that librarians in our branches that do programming and, the branches that have, before the pandemic had tutoring and study rooms, like we interface with homeschooling parents all the time. I mean, they're a big part of the community we serve, and the services we provide are really important to a lot of them. So we take that seriously.
Great, thank you. And there's another question from the audience, and I think this is going to be the closing question. And I'd like to pose the question to all four of you to respond. And Seema, I'll ask you to go first with this question. How would you like to see us support libraries and books? What can we do what would your advice be to people to support your local library and to support people getting a chance to read books?
I think supporting the local library would comprise of just going to the library consistently, bringing your kids to the library and making them aware of all the resources that the library has to offer, because it truly is a really cool place that does a lot for the community. And I guess trying to go there consistently, and I think making connections with the librarians is a good resource as well, because they can definitely introduce you to many different sections of the library and different types of books that you might not have even been familiar with, and provide new perspectives that might make you feel seen and represented in ways that you haven't been before. So just going to the library consistently and using it as a resource, I think, is really important. And I think it would prove to be very beneficial for a lot of people.
Well said, Seema. Thank you very much for that comment. And Donnie, what do you think? What's your advice?
Let me make sure that I understand the question completely. How to support
libraries, and I think the implication
libraries.
is libraries and access to books.
Well, I believe that we need to expand what we see as acceptable or celebrated literature. When I was a young teacher, so very long ago, I had real opinions, very strong opinions about what my students should be reading and what was not good enough to be reading. And I didn't let them read Twilight, and I didn't let them read the Harry Potter books, not because I thought they were inappropriate, but they weren't real literature. And I had a lot of gatekeeping going on, and gatekeeping is it's not banning, but it's a step two. It's restricting. And so when I discovered graphic novels and when I discovered, you know, poetry that was more like rap lyrics that was being published in books, and I started opening up what I considered to be literature. I increased my students' literacy, you know, by exponential means. And the pathway to some books is, you know, if you get into some books, then you get into more books. And then from those more books, create more avenues to more books. And so I think just being a little bit more open-minded about what we celebrate and who we celebrate and how we celebrate it.
Great. Thank you, Donnie. Gail?
I would say, and I guess it's sort of the same answer, but I'm thinking about both public libraries and school libraries. I mean, support them financially. I mean, I think about many schools don't even have libraries because they just don't have the financial support for it. And that's been a real issue. You see that more in rural communities and communities of color and low income communities. And it could be because they just don't have the facilities, they don't have the staffing, they don't have the materials. Many school libraries are very poorly stocked, if you will. So it's not even a matter of restricting access. It's a matter of just like the access not even being there because the materials aren't there. And certainly the same is true for public libraries as well. I mean, public libraries operate with a different infrastructure and, you know, some different rules and supports and that sort of thing. But the more financially supported public libraries are, the more reach they have in terms of access. I mean, I live in a semi-rural community with a small public library branch. I'm grateful that we have a public library branch. I think about communities like mine that don't have a public library branch, where you have to travel some distance to get to a public library, and they're relying on bookmobiles and other mechanisms to try to get access. And so, you know, financial support in whatever way, I think makes a huge difference.
Great. Thank you, Gail. Justin?
Yeah, +1 on financial. And also, I would specifically call out school libraries. California, our state, it's absolutely shameful the amount of schools that don't have a school librarian for the amount of students that we have. Every school should have a library and library staff. Like, go to your schools and be involved in getting a good library going for your kids. So that's, just to tack onto that, but like more generally my answer. So I just started watching Ted Lasso. I came to it late. And for those of you that do know Ted Lasso, there's this great maxim in the first season near the end where he says something to the effect of, instead of being judgmental, be curious. And I would say to support libraries, that's what I'd ask. We're in a curiosity business. It's what we do, is serve curiosity, to be there for people who are curious. And I'd say that to support us, whether you're someone who loves libraries and are curious about all that we can do and want to know how, what you can do through us, or if you're somebody who's like, okay, what are you up to there, library, with this book? What's going on? How did this book get here? Be curious. Don't be judgmental. Be curious. Come in and ask. And you'll find that not only will you get answers, but like it will help us, because it will feed, it will give us the information we need to serve everybody better.
That's great. Well, Justin, thank you very much for those comments, and thank you for being with us this evening. This has just been a great conversation. And Dr. Gail Pittman, I want to thank you as well for your time and your insightful comments here. Donnie Serla, thank you, and appreciate you making this happen during a week of finals and all the hard work you're doing as a teacher. And I also, of course, want to thank Seema Tappa. Seema, I can't wait until your book is in the Sacramento Library, and we're all waiting for that. So we all encourage you to pursue your desire to be a writer. That's a great way to have a career and a great way to share your thoughts with the rest of the world too.
We always stock local authors, just saying.
There you go. There you go. See, he's all ready. And I want to thank Peter Coyle, the library director and CEO of the Sacramento Public Library, and especially for doing this series. Let's talk about it. These are great sessions. And I also want to thank Kathy Crosswaith and Shane Kent behind the scenes, making all this work. I want to remind you that a recording's been made of this session. It's on the website. It'll be on the website, saclibrary.org, later this week. And also, I want to remind the audience that a collection of banned books is available with your library card at saclibrary.org or on the library app. So we want you to be able to take advantage of that as well. So with that, I think we're finishing just a few minutes later than we had planned. We planned for 7:30, but this was such a great conversation. And so I want to lastly thank all of you who tuned in this evening to this Let's Talk About It. You're an important part of this conversation as well. So on behalf of all of us, have a great evening and a great upcoming weekend. And be sure and read. Thank you very much.